There are two objections that someone might make to this view that ethics is based on caring. That ultimately is Noddings' view. That that the first feeling that generates ethical interactions with others is natural caring, but then the follow-up of extending that natural caring to a wider circle is a real core of morality. It's also hard to do. It's harder to do than natural caring. Okay, but the overall view is one where ethics is grounded ultimately in sentiment. It's ultimately grounded in a certain kind of feeling-based response to the possibility of caring. And there are a couple of objections here, okay, that are possible to this view. One is, what about people who just don't feel natural caring? Maybe because there's something wrong with their brain chemistry, and when they see a person who's suffering, they don't automatically feel a desire to help that person who's suffering. Maybe they even feel the opposite. They think it's fun to cause pain to others, for instance. Okay, so what should we say about a person like that who doesn't feel natural caring? Well, Noddings responds by saying there can't be any actual ethical demand that they feel that. So she says it's actually not an ethical issue whether or not they feel natural caring, because it's not their fault if they don't feel it. And she describes the impulse of natural caring, the sort of first step of morality, as something that arises naturally in the absence of pathology. In other words, some kind of sickness or disease or something constitutionally wrong with a person. Okay. She goes on to say, we cannot demand that one have this impulse, but we shrink from one who never has it. One who never feels the pain of another, who never confesses the internal I must that is so familiar to most of us. This is the I must of, I must help this person, or I must help relieve their suffering, okay, is beyond our normal pattern of understanding. Her case is pathological and we avoid her. So basically Noddings' response to this case is, well, people who don't feel natural caring just can't be ethical, and we should just avoid them. They're sick people, they're not trustworthy, and we basically have to give up on them. Okay, so you might ask yourself whether that's an adequate response. Remember that Kant, for instance, described a person who was philanthropic but felt no love in their heart for other human beings. They were philanthropic purely out of a sense of duty. So, they do charity work. They try to alleviate the suffering of the poor and the hungry and so on. But they just have no love in their heart for humanity. They're only doing it out of a sense of duty. Okay, and Kant said such a person would be moral. Okay, in fact, Kant said that person would be more moral than someone who was benevolent and charitable out of inclination. That is, that they were benevolent and charitable because they liked to help others. All right, which is kind of a paradoxical result. Noddings is saying the opposite. She's saying someone who doesn't like helping others can't be moral. Someone who never feels natural caring has no basis for extending that natural caring into a wider and wider circle of people, and so they actually have no basis for being ethical themselves. They're just, sadly, they're just someone who's incapable of acting in the right ways. So again, I just want to pose a question to you. Who do you think is more right about this? Is it Noddings or is it Kant? Do you think that someone who doesn't feel natural caring can still be ethical? Or do you think it's just there's some people that ethics is just beyond them because they don't feel the things they need to feel in order to be ethical? A second question that you could ask Noddings is, what about those beings that at least some people have said we have ethical obligations towards, but we can't enter into a reciprocal caring relationship with, okay? And so some examples there would be distant others, that is, for instance, people who are starving, people who are suffering from what Singer calls absolute poverty around the world. I mentioned that in another video lecture for this week. But people who are starving in faraway countries, for instance, do we have any ethical obligations to them? And what about animals? Do we have any ethical obligations to them? So Noddings answers this in basically the same way for both of those cases. She says, our obligation is limited and delimited by relation. We're never free in the human domain to abandon our preparedness to care, but practically, if we're meeting those in our inner circles adequately as one's caring and receiving those linked to our inner circles by formal chains of reaction, we shall limit the calls upon our obligation quite naturally. We are not obliged to care for starving children in Africa, because there is no way for this caring to be completed in the other unless I abandon the caring to which I am obligated. So the fact that her example is starving children in Africa rather than somewhere else doesn't really matter. It's not the particular continent that matters. What matters is she's saying we don't have a responsibility to care for everyone in the world. We don't have a responsibility to care for everyone who's suffering. Okay, we have a responsibility to care for those that we already have some relation with, or we might be able to have a relation with. Okay, or so again, relation is kind of the first step to being able to develop reciprocity. And if we don't have relation yet, then we don't actually have any kind of I must. No kind of I must or obligation or ethical caring can get generated in that case. Okay, so again, Nodding says we don't have an obligation to try to alleviate suffering of people around the world. We have an obligation to people. We have more of an obligation to the person that we run into in our community, or that's in our family, or otherwise that we're already related to that's suffering. We have more of a responsibility to alleviate their suffering than we do to alleviate that of some faraway person who's suffering that we don't know and have never met, even if the person who lives far away and we've never met is suffering more severely than the people that are closer to us. Okay, so who we have an obligation to is partly a matter of who we're already related to on Nodding's account. And about animals, she says the same thing, because she thinks that animals can't actually reciprocate caring as fully as human beings can. Maybe they can to a very minimal extent, but animals can't really care for us to the same extent that we can care for them. Now, I know some of you are going to be like giving me stories about your pet cat and how your cat came over and rescued you from depression one day by just putting her cute little head on your lap, and then you got jolted out of your depression. But the cat probably wasn't trying to do that, right? The cat probably wasn't deliberately trying to save you from your depression. And even if they were, it's a pretty small gesture of caring compared to how frequently you probably feed your cat, right? So it's so asymmetrical, it's so uneven, the relationship between animals and humans, that it can't really be reciprocal. It can't be like even caring going back and forth. And because of that, we can't get into that highest state of a caring relationship with animals. And so for that reason, it's our ethical obligations to animals are much less, according to Noddings. So you'll notice that in both of these cases, Noddings has taken a position very different from that of the utilitarians. If we look at, for instance, Peter Singer and his arguments that we have an ethical obligation to alleviate the suffering of people all around the world, even though we don't know them personally. Okay, it's a very different conclusion than Nodding's conclusion here. And the difference has to do with the differences in their ethical theories. And likewise about animals. So utilitarians think whether we can get into a caring relationship with animals doesn't matter. What matters is that animals feel pain and pleasure. And so we have a responsibility not to cause them pain. So again, very different answers from Noddings and from utilitarians about this.